The Sony FX30 versus the Sony ZV-E10. Now typically when people compare the Sony FX30 versus the ZV-E10, they go straight to the specs. And on the front end, that seems logical. However, simply comparing specs doesn't help you grasp how and why the Sony FX30 and the Sony ZV-E10 are different from each other. Now specs don't always relate directly to picture quality, and they also don't give you a real-world view of your final picture outcome. Now to illustrate this, take a look at these two side-by-side videos, and can you guess which is the Sony FX30 and which one is the Sony ZV-E10? Now both of these were shot on the Rokinon 12mm f2.0 lens at the same time with the same settings. Now although the settings were the same, I shot in S-Log3 on the FX30 and Rec 709 on the Sony ZV-E10. The reason I'm comparing Rec 709 to S-Log3 footage is because the FX30's advantage over the Sony ZV-E10 spec-wise is its ability to shoot S-Log3 10-bit 422, which relates to bit depth and wider color gamut. But how does this really play out in the real world? Now more than likely here on YouTube, you can't see the difference and you would more than likely just be guessing. And this is why specs by themselves can be misleading. Now, although specs have some value, they don't always impact the actual video you'll get out of your camera. So you may be asking yourself, okay, so are you saying specs mean nothing? No, specs are valuable bits of information. However, most of the time, we don't look at specs with the right mindset. Now, specs are meant to tell us what the camera is capable of, but specs don't dictate the image we get with our camera. The image we get out of our camera will fall on how we use our camera and what knowledge we have about the work that we're doing. Now, a quick tip is superior camera specs don't automatically mean that it's going to translate to a better picture. So you may be asking yourself, if specs don't always directly impact the final picture, then why are you even comparing the Sony FX30 versus the Sony ZV-E10? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason I'm comparing the Sony FX30 versus the Sony ZV-E10 is because how we arrive at our final picture and what sets these two cameras apart. This is also known as workflow. So what is workflow? Well, workflow is the process by which you go about setting up, capturing, editing, exporting, and delivering your final video. Now, without understanding the context of workflow, then specs become the measuring tool by which we compare cameras, and this can often be very misleading. Oh, that is evil. So how are the workflows between the Sony FX30 and the Sony ZV-E10 different? Well, let's start with the Sony ZV-E10. Now, the Sony ZV-E10 is aimed at vloggers, so all of the buttons and functions are tailored to make settings very simple and accessible. Now this is accomplished by having very few buttons, which makes the Sony ZV-E10 straightforward. Now to get the Sony ZV-E10 up and running, you simply need a battery, memory card, a lens, and a mic. You set your aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and you set your white balance. Now if you want to be a bit more advanced, you can set up your zebras, which I'll link a video above on how to do that. And then you can add an ND filter if you need. And with these settings, you pretty much are ready to shoot. So you shoot your video, you bring it into your editor, you cut up your footage, you add some video tweaks where needed, then you export, and just like that, you're done. Now, let's look at the Sony FX30. Now, the Sony FX30 was built as a cinema camera. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, a cinema camera is designed and built for producing films. Film sets are controlled environments where lighting, sound, and set design are primary and most important so that the actors can be captured in a realistic, detailed manner. Now, like the Sony ZV-E10, to get the Sony FX30 up and running, you simply need a battery, memory card, a lens, a mic, and then you set your aperture and your shutter speed. But here is where the differences start. Now keep in mind, these settings that I'm gonna go over are to get the most out of your Sony FX30. I'm aware that the camera can do more, but I'm focusing on getting the most out of it. So we'll be shooting an S-Log3 because capturing as much detail as possible is the goal with this camera. And attention to details are going to set this camera apart from the Sony ZV-E10 when it comes to workflow. Now, white balance is set manually using a gray card or white balance card. Now, this can be done on the ZV-E10 as well, but this is standard procedure when using the Sony FX30. Now, that's why there's a dedicated button for white balance and no automatic setting when shooting in Cine EI on S-Log3. Now, you will then choose between only 2 ISO settings depending on what your scene looks like. Now, these 2 ISOs are known as dual base ISO. Now, base ISO is sensor gain level that doesn't require your camera to add any additional voltage to the signal, resulting in less noise in your final picture. Now, if you don't understand any of this, don't worry. There's much more to getting a clean picture with this camera. So then you will need a way to monitor what you're recording if you're shooting in S-Log3. This means you need to either use the built-in S-Log3 to Rec. 709 LUT that can be used on the back of the Sony FX30 screen, or you will need to use an external monitor like the Atomos Ninja V to monitor your recordings. Now, because you're trying to get the cleanest picture with the most amount of color and luma information, there are more steps that you need to take. Now, one step is accurately monitoring your exposure. Now, to do this, you'll need to set up your zebras or use false color or EL zone to display exposure values. Now, again, if none of this makes sense, don't worry because there's much more. Capturing the cleanest picture, getting as much color and luma information as possible comes at a sacrifice. Data. The more information you gather with the Sony FX30, the more data it requires. Now, this means that you need memory cards that not only have a large capacity, but also have fast data transfer rates. Now, the Sony FX30 requires use of a CF Express card, or you can use an external monitor to capture video in ProRes with an Atomos Ninja V or V+, or one of the newer Ninjas that have come out. Now, if you aren't recording in ProRes and recording 4K 10-bit 422 internally on the FX30, you will need a powerful computer in order to be able to play back the footage and edit within your editor. Now, remember, the Sony ZV-E10 is a what you see is what you get camera, meaning what you see on the back of your screen is the final picture, unless you decide to tweak it later in post. Now, that brings us to color. Now, when you import your S-Log3 footage from your FX30, it will look washed out because you're looking at the footage in log form. This needs to be transformed into a viewable format so that colors and luminance can be color corrected and graded. Now, some people will use a LUT to do this, and some will use a color managed workspace like ACES. Now, the biggest separation between the Sony ZV-E10 and the Sony FX30 is color grading and color matching. Now, the Sony FX30 is great for color matching other cameras, using green screens and pulling or pushing colors. But this doesn't mean that the Sony ZV-E10 cannot produce good colors and handle grading. It definitely can. However, don't expect it to do the things as smoothly as the FX30 does. So the big question is, should you buy a Sony FX30 if you want to upgrade from the Sony ZV-E10? Well, that depends. If you're looking to shoot film and have a lot of control and are willing to put in a lot of time in mastering the tools that come with such a camera, if the answer is yes, then go for it. It's a great camera. Now, if you aren't planning on shooting films and you just want to be able to churn out content quickly and live stream and vlog, then go for the Sony ZV-E10. It's smaller and lighter, and it's gonna be really easy for you to do that. Now, I can already hear in the comments people saying, now you can still get the Sony FX30 and not use S-Log and still have a camera that can shoot 10-bit 422, and you can also live stream. To which I would say, sure, you can do that. However, I think it makes more sense to save money by getting the Sony ZV-E10 if you aren't going to be doing complex film work, and focus on lighting and lenses. Now, keep in mind, the Sony FX30 can take photos. However, it doesn't have a mechanical shutter. This means you cannot use flash with the camera for photography, where you can with the Sony ZV-E10. So this means that the Sony ZV-E10 is going to be able to give you both photography and videography. And if you want to expand your photography, adding flash is a huge update. So keep that in mind. Now, no matter what camera you buy, whether it's the Sony a6700, the Sony ZV-E10, the Sony FX3, the Sony FX30, the Sony FX6, or even the Sony Venice, lighting is going to take you much farther along than simply having a 10-bit camera. Now, let me know in the comments below which one you have or which camera you want to get. But until next time, I'll holler at y'all later. I'm out. Peace.